Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the online learning channel. My name is Brad, and today I'm going to be assisting you with English, specifically focusing on the grade 12 curriculum. Now, remember, when it comes to English, there are a number of different aspects that essentially define the subject as a whole. And for today, we are going to be focusing on the aspect that refers to reading and viewing. So what I have for you is a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share with you this morning, so as to just guide the process, answer any kind of questions you may have with regards to the reading and viewing aspect of English. And for today's purposes, what we're going to be focusing on in particular is the idea of a comprehension. Okay, so without further ado, let us get straight into it. Okay, so with regards to today's focus and objectives, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on the aspect of reading and viewing. And specifically, it has to do with reading for comprehension purposes. And to add one step further, it's making use of strategies using written texts. So, of course, when it comes to comprehension, a lot of the time we are dealing with a written text that we need to understand and analyze for ourselves. So now when it comes to comprehensions, there are generally three different types of comprehension-like questions you could receive. So this is just the general scope. So first and foremost, you may have what's known as a general comprehension. You then have what's known as a vocabulary type. And then thirdly, you have what's known as a technical type. So just to go through a couple of definitions there. When it comes to a general comprehension, this is essentially testing your understanding of the text. Okay, so often questions that could come your way in a general comprehension account for the writer's feelings in paragraph 1, for instance. So remember, with comprehensions, often is the case that the paragraphs will be numbered, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, however many paragraphs there may be. And there's also an indication as to what lines the actual examiner may refer to when asking you a question. So then going on to a vocabulary type of comprehension, this tests word meanings such as synonyms or antonyms. So we have an example here. Explain what the writer means by the young men and women seem lost in the designer clothes, dwarfed and dehumanized by their possessions, as if ownership has gone into reverse. So that's an example that we're going to be referring to a little bit later on in the presentation when I share with you the actual comprehension and the theme that this particular question is referring to. Then we have the third type of comprehension-like question you could receive, and this is the technical type. So this is essentially testing the style, the presentation, or the construction of the text. So for instance, if we were to make use of an example, explain the writer's purpose in referring to various research findings. So that's in line with the actual content of the comprehension in question. And we'll obviously have to go through the comprehension to understand the context of this question. So when it comes to the different types of comprehensions, we've just got a table here that just includes the type of question together with the possible responses that you could present in your actual answers. So if a question is asking you to make use of statistics or numbers or the idea of direct speech, a possible response could be in the form of, the particular notion adds credibility, there's a validity factor, there's an authenticity that provokes an emotional response to convince or manipulate or persuade the viewer. And this is often the case when one comes across statistics or numbers or direct speech. So when the question is referring to grammar or style, example that's being made use of here, the use of formal or conversational language, slang, personal pronouns, I, you, we, for instance, the choice of diction, the use of punctuation, and potentially the use of a hyperbole. So the possible responses in this case involves or engages the reader personally, This could be via the use of colloquial language or informal language. It adds credibility, again, validity, authenticity. This is more so in the form of formal writing. It provokes an emotional response, so the use of emotive words. And again, it adds authenticity to reach a possible solution. So then you may get rhetorical questions or the use of repetition when it comes to comprehension. So again, possible responses provokes an emotional response, encourages thinking or the establishment of an opinion, and emphasizes and highlights the writer's point about whatever the case may be. And then thirdly, it convinces, manipulates, or persuades the reader into taking a particular viewpoint. Short paragraphs or single sentences often emphasize or highlight the writer's point, message, and evokes a response. It also adds a kind of impact-like factor that just gets straight to the point. So now, when it comes to comprehensions, of course, there can be a variety of topics that the examiner may make use of in an exam, for instance, or any form of assessment. So it's important that students read, tune into news channels, generally keep up to date with current affairs, whether that's via an app on your phone or maybe viewing the actual television screen or scrolling online on various news sites. It's important to keep up to date with the general themes that essentially define society in the world that we live in today. So as the speech bubble suggests, it's important to be familiar with current events, and in a sense, it's about getting topical. Okay, so the different types of comprehension that you could receive, once again, comprehension is about reading for understanding and meaning. It's not just a case of, scanning through the content, going through the actual, say, paragraphs and just directly looking for a straightforward answer that you could copy and paste into your, say, exam, for instance. It's a case of understanding the content, understanding the context in which the actual writer is, writing this particular article or whatever it may be. And it's important to understand what kind of point of view that they are essentially coming from. Okay, so this may look like a lengthy slide, but this is essentially the comprehension that we're going to make use of. Okay, so the title of this particular comprehension, materialism. So to add on to this particular title, it's making mention of the fact that materialism is a system that eats us from the inside out. Okay, so that may sound a little bit ambiguous, it may sound a little bit vague at first. So it's important for us to now read through the content and understand what the actual author of this article means by the fact that materialism is eating society out from the inside. Okay, so with regards to the comprehension itself, as you can see, what I've done here is I've broken it down into various paragraphs. The first slide is making mention of the first 3 paragraphs. The second slide then goes on to the next 4, and then the third slide makes mention of the final 3 paragraphs. Okay, so this is from a past paper, and a lot of the questions that are asked to begin with often require an explanation technique. So this is an approach that we would need to take in order to answer the questions. Okay, so just to get a general sense as to what this comprehension is about, let's just read through the first paragraph and try and make sense of it. Okay, so that they are crass, brash, and trashy goes without saying. But there's something in the pictures posted on rich kids of Instagram that inspires more than the usual revulsion towards crude displays of opulence. There's a shadow in these photos of a young man wearing all 4 of his Rolex watches, a youth posing in front of his helicopter, endless pictures of cars, yachts, shoes, mansions, swimming pools, and spoiled teenagers throwing gangster poses in private jets of something worse, something that after you have seen a few dozen times becomes disorientating, even distressing. Okay, so from reading that, one almost gets the impression that this particular author is quite critical of a particular aspect of society, and it seems to be targeting the youth in a way that would suggest that those that are living a lavish lifestyle or one of opulence are now really flaunting this particular experience that they are having via social media channels. In this particular case, it's making mention of Instagram as a platform in which many of these members of society are just flaunting their wealth and their just general lack of care really for anything else other than themselves in society. Okay, so it goes on, of course, to elaborate on what exactly this kind of aspect of society refers to. But, obviously for your purposes, it would be in your best interest to read through each paragraph, focus specifically on what the actual meaning behind the paragraph may be and what kind of context is being displayed. Okay, so the second slide is now making mention of a couple of statistics, if you will, or a couple of research findings, like we mentioned earlier, that again, just bring across a kind of form of empirical evidence, so to speak. So empirical evidence is essentially evidence that brings across factual information. So now, according to this author, in one study, researchers tested a group of 18-year-olds, then retested them 12 years later. They were asked to rank the importance of different goals when it comes to things like jobs, money, and status on one side, and self-acceptance, fellow feeling, and belonging on the other. So they were then given a standard diagnostic test to identify mental health problems. At the ages of both 18 and 30, materialistic people, those that subscribe to materialism, were more susceptible to disorders. But if in that period they became less materialistic, they were essentially happier. So another study psychologists in Iceland conducted was whether Icelanders weathering their country's economic collapse would become more focused on materialism in the hope of regaining lost ground. Others responded by becoming less interested in money and turning their attention to things like family and community life. The first group reported lower levels of well-being. The second group reported higher levels. So it's clearly a differentiation here between those that are living a materialistic lifestyle and those that are essentially living a lifestyle where only their basic needs are being attended to. There's no kind of sense of lavish lifestyle in this particular case. Okay, so the third slide then goes on to mention another aspect of materialism. So the two varieties of materialism that have this effect, using possessions as a yardstick of success and seeking happiness through acquisition, are the varieties that seem to be on this display of rich kids on Instagram. So clearly this is the aspect of society that's being criticized. It was only after reading this paper that I understood why those photos distressed me. So at first glance, the author's clearly becoming distressed, but maybe they're trying to make sense as to why they're becoming distressed, hence writing this article. They look like a kind of social self-mutilation. Okay, so what does the author mean by that? Materialism forces us to compare our possessions to those of others. There's no end to it. If you have 4 Rolexes while another has 5, you are a Rolex short of contentment. Okay, so the material pursuit of self-esteem, in a sense, reduces your own self-esteem. So it may also leave a trail of unpayable debts, practically speaking, mental illness, psychologically speaking, and smashed relationships. So in a social context. So materialism, essentially, according to the author, smashes the happiness and peace of mind of those that succumb to it. So again, the author is almost making the point that materialism is a kind of lure that society has now created over time that just really grapples people in a way that forces them to succumb to these urges and these needs and this kind of way of life that dictates almost self-gratification, instant gratification, and self-worth is very much dependent on what exactly you possess as opposed to who you are as a character and how it is that you, say, participate in society or contribute to, your own well-being or your family's well-being. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, this is a comprehension from a past paper, and we're going to go through a couple of questions now that just make mention of this comprehension. And as mentioned, the first few questions require what is known as a point explanation technique. So we're going to go into some details as to what that refers to. Okay, so the first question. account for the writer's feelings in paragraph 1. So, like we mentioned earlier in the actual presentation, this is often one of the first questions you would come across in a typical comprehension. So, what I have here is, again, a table that provides us with the question together with possible answers. So, the answer in this case, the writer is disgusted by or pities, these are his feelings, as you can see in the actual bracket, the flashy or obscene display of wealth that is displayed by spoiled teenagers. Okay, so this is his account of his feelings as indicated in that particular answer. So now the second question, explain what the writer means by the young men and women seem lost in the designer clothes, dwarfed and dehumanized by their possessions as if ownership has gone into reverse. Okay, so the possessions seem to own the person. That's been made pretty clear from the get-go, who has been dwarfed. The youth have become less human, i.e. dehumanized by their possessions as if ownership has been reversed. So what does it mean to be human? Well, clearly the author feels that it does not pertain to materialistic or a materialistic lifestyle or materialistic possessions. Okay, so just a point to note, many students, when faced with this particular question, discuss all the concepts of the question, such as dwarfed and dehumanized and ownership has gone into reverse, but they don't actually account for the actual author's feelings or how it is that he now perceives these particular, say, aspects of society. Okay, so the next question, discuss the point the writer is making in lines 14 to 15. So often is the case in comprehensions, we'll have a column that is dedicated to the number of lines indicated. In this case, we have to refer to lines 14 and 15. And in this case, lines 14 and 15 are making mention of a photograph whose purpose is to illustrate plenty seems instead to depict a void. Okay, so we need to understand what a void is. Often a void is just an empty blank space that doesn't have any kind of purpose or meaning attached to it. So the answer in this case, it is ironic that, this is the point, while these young people are intending to flaunt their abundant possessions, they're clearly keen to now display what they have, they actually reveal how empty their lives are. So this is a form of evidence that the writer has now essentially illustrated, and it is now something that we have understood from their perspective and now have offered it in the form of evidence to substantiate our answers. Okay, so another point to make mention of or to take note of, it's important to explain or link back to the point. Always use words like but, however, although when answering a question that pertains to irony. Okay, so next question. Refer to paragraphs 3, 4, and 5. Explain the writer's purpose in referring to various speech findings. Okay, so the writer wishes to provide convincing evidence to support his view and validate it, add credibility to his argument. So it goes without saying that this writer feels very strongly about his points of view, and he wants to provide as much, say, validity or credibility to his arguments as to convince readers who may share his viewpoint. Okay, so when it comes to the paper, we're moving on to a few further questions that now ask us to analyze the type of diction utilized by the author. Okay, so the question in this case, why, in your view, does the writer distinguish between consumers, in inverted commas, and citizens, in inverted commas? So again, what the question has offered us is a direct link between this particular question and where it is in the comprehension that we may find the answer. So line 38, this is the actual, say, line that's been made mention of, and this gives us some important information to work with. Okay, so potential answer. Clearly, it's a negative connotation that's attached to the word consumer, who is viewed as an individual who purchases goods without any kind of discernment. It's just a case of purchasing for the sake of purchasing. They are often self-absorbed individuals. They are more competitive, not only amongst themselves, but with their peers, and they are essentially more selfish, who do not engage with others and lack any kind of social responsibility. Okay, so these kind of consumers are exactly that. They're just consuming. They're not necessarily doing so in a way that is sustainable. Citizens, okay, inverted commas, carries a positive connotation. So they would be discerning and add value to society. So a citizen is someone that is now contributing in a positive sense. The question, however, important to note here, did not ask to define the terms. It's more so the concept of distinguishing between what a citizen in this particular case is and what a consumer is. You need to tell the difference between the two. Okay, so next question, paragraph 7, it's asking us to discuss the paradox that's evident. Now remember, a paradox is a seemingly absurd or contradictory statement or proposition which when investigated may prove to be well-founded or true. Okay, so despite initial thoughts, actually at the end of the day, even though the concept may be difficult to understand at first, it may actually reveal the truth in a sense. So the answer, the research findings are contrary to what people believe. So materialism is often associated with happiness, according to what the experiences of the youth are in this particular case. However, the author feels that materialism is the enemy of fulfillment. People turn to consumerism to fill their loneliness. This is a kind of psychological theory that he is now proposing. Yet this consumerism makes them lonelier and isolated. A consumer journal should promote consumerism, yet this one publishes negative viewpoints of consumerism. Okay, so even though it is now presenting a story on the aspect of consumerism, one would like to think that it's somehow making a case for it or trying to promote it in some senses, but in this case, clearly, it's quite the opposite. It is, in fact, criticizing the concept of consumerism. So important notes to make mention of, like irony, a question with a paradox in it must include words like yet, however, but, in order for the writer to now show any kind of discrepancy. Okay, so it's important to understand that the writer obviously has a particular approach that he or she is now taking to this particular article. And it's important to understand what is the writer's message? What is their aim? What is their intention? Why did they write this particular piece in the first place? That's the whole beauty of comprehension. It allows us to understand it for not only ourselves, but to try and put ourselves in the shoes of the writer themselves. So, question, 2 elements of style, literary devices. Okay, so the next question. Refer to paragraph 8. Critically comment on 2 elements of style used by the writer in this paragraph. Okay, so style-like questions, literary devices, as the previous slide made mention of, that the writer uses to create a feel for his or her work or to convey a message. So it just gives you a feel as to what kind of tone or what kind of diction the actual writer is making use of to get his or her message across. Okay, so important note to make mention of. Firstly, when answering a style-like question, you need to ask the question, what is the writer's message? What are their aims? What are their intentions? Secondly, you need to look at one or more of the following literary devices and see how it links to the writer's message. Okay, so like mentioned earlier, diction, first and foremost. You have to look for emotive-like words. Punctuation, also important to keep in mind. Things like question marks, rhetorical questions, exclamation marks, any kind of eclipses. And then the use of personal pronouns, like I, we, metaphorical language, the use of hyperboles, satire, sarcasm, and the structure of the paragraph. Is it a sentence? Is it a couple of lines? Is it an actual, say, lengthy paragraph at the end of the day? That all adds to your understanding. Okay, so now, if we were to ask the question again, critically comment on 2 elements of style used by the writer in this paragraph. Okay, so when it comes to style, you have what's known as conversational style. The use of personal pronouns creates a bond of confidence between the writer and the reader, so as to kind of just associate with one another. So the writer, in this case, uses stylistic techniques to strengthen his argument that materialism gives rise to a cycle of destruction. For what? For why? Now? How? These are the kind of questions you can ask yourself. So metaphorical expressions such as hyperboles, in this case self-mutilation and smashed, are used to highlight the destructive nature of obsession with these particular possessions. The satirical remark of a Rolex short of contentment graphically illustrates the insatiable, unquenchable, greedy nature of materialism. That's a pretty good one. And at the end of the day, the writer often inserts a short exclamation to now get his point across. There's no end to it, to emphasize his exasperation with endless consumerism. So he's completely flabbergasted as to, the level of consumerism that is just, engulfing this particular generation. Okay, so the use of strong emotive words, such as that refers to diction. You could make mention of words like distressed or forces and smashes. This often is linked directly to the concept of destruction. Okay, moving on then. Paragraph 10. Is paragraph 10 a suitable conclusion to the article as a whole? Justify your response. So now whenever you see a question about the conclusion, think, summarize. Okay, so this is an opportunity now for you to summarize what exactly the writer or the author of this particular piece has had to say. So when it comes to summarizing, some of you may be familiar with this, others maybe not, but it's essentially a bite-sized, say, piece that just basically breaks down the article as a whole and just offers some kind of perspective on what the message is at the end of the day. Okay, so potential answer. The writer summarizes the adverse or negative impact of materialism. Okay, so that is what exactly they have aimed to do. But now you need to justify why they have done this. Okay, so what is the reason? So he refers to the initial image of a deluded youth, okay, and expands on his focus to the broader society. So it's starting off as if the youth are the kind of, the crux of this conversation, and slowly but surely, with enough influence and enough, say, with enough, say, know-how in terms of society becoming more and more familiar with these habits, it starts to expand and it starts to influence broader society. So he also draws the reader into his argument through the use of first-person pronouns. Okay, so it almost gives you a sense that he's trying to reach you on a personal level. He's trying to now invite you into his world and try relate, in a sense, as to what he exactly or she is trying to bring across in terms of their message. So what's the point of all of this? The writer contends that every member of society falls prey to the destructive cycle of materialism. So at the end of the day, anyone is susceptible to materialism. As to whether you choose to partake in these kind of behaviors or these, particular, say, approaches, that's of course up to the individual at the end of the day. But as we know, generally speaking, those that are not as perhaps informed of the potential consequences of this materialistic way of life are quite prone to being influenced and may, unfortunately, be susceptible to things like peer pressure, for instance, if they, of course, have the means to do so. Okay, so now when analyzing comprehension, one has to ask the question, what is the aim of the conclusion? Does it fulfill the aim? How do you know this? You have to provide evidence from the text, of course. Often is the case. You need to provide evidence in order to just justify your arguments or your points made. Okay, so moving on from the comprehension itself, here we have an actual image that, again, at the same time, doesn't directly refer to what was being mentioned in the comprehension, but it does have some kind of connection in the sense that it is making a comparison between what is perceived as success and what is essentially, the reality of the matter at the end of the day. Okay, so this particular cartoon is making mention of the Hollywood effect. So the Hollywood effect is asking the question what we should be thinking while watching a particular film. In this particular case, it's The Wolf of Wall Street. Okay, so a film that came out a few years ago that now documents how one particular individual, in this case Jordan Belfort, was able to manipulate people into just purchasing stocks that didn't necessarily have any kind of value, but he convinced them that they did, and ultimately exploited and took advantage of that in order to make millions and live a life of opulence. So in this particular cartoon, one viewer is bringing across their, say, impression versus another, and that's the purpose of the cartoon, just to kind of cross-reference what the two viewers are now thinking. So the first viewer, quite clearly in this case, feeling quite disgusted or quite negative towards the behaviors of this particular man and what the movie is now portraying of him. So as indicated in the speech bubble, what a bunch of greedy, morally reprehensible, prison-worthy crooks. Okay, so not only is this a case of making mention of Jordan Belfort, but of course all those that were working alongside him. And then what we were really thinking at the end of the day when viewing this particular film, or as is the case with the majority of people, one can only assume, you can't necessarily say for sure, nice car, hot babe, cool yacht, awesome party. These are all aspects of the movie that are now portrayed in a kind of appealing light. Not to say that everyone thinks that those aspects are appealing, clearly as indicated by the first viewer, but in some cases people may view that as desirable ways of living. You know, they have access to these things, you know, things like a nice car or yacht, for instance, or attending parties that, you know, bring about a sense of excitement and joy on a level that had never really been experienced before. Okay, so that's clearly members of society that are now viewing the film in the movie house, and it's just giving us a sneak peek into their thoughts via the speech bubble. Okay, so the first question in this case, explain how the thought bubbles of the two characters convey their attitudes toward the film. Okay, so in a nutshell, we've essentially just covered that, but if we were to go into some more detail, remember to note when answering this question, for an attitude-like question, you have to immediately think of suitable adjectives for the attitude. Okay, so in this case, it's important that we can add a suitable adjective to describe the attitude. In this question, the use of directional phrases, the left, the right, in this particular case, only provide an explanation of the thought bubbles in terms of the attitude of the people. So the answer, okay, so the viewer on the left is clearly disgusted. This is his attitude by what he's viewing. Now you need to explain why he's disgusted. He views the characters in the film as shameful criminals. He embodies the morally correct reaction to what he is viewing. This is his personal persona. The viewer on the right, as indicated in the notes, the right versus the left, is enthusiastic or engaged. This is his attitude as he enjoys and is susceptible to this kind of lavish lifestyle. So one has to offer a comparison between the two characters in order to answer this question. Okay, so back to the actual image itself, just to refresh our memories as to what is exactly going on here. Remember, we have a sneak peek now of two viewers that are watching a Hollywood film. In this particular case, The Wolf of Wall Street. One is now being guided by his moral compass, clearly disgusted by the actions of some of these personnel that are now exploiting society, and the other is taking quite a liking to it and almost saying to himself that this is a desirable lifestyle. Okay, so in this case, to what extent does text B, in this case the cartoon, support the title and paragraph of text A, in this case the actual comprehension that we made mention of earlier? So a note to make mention of, many learners in the past have now offered a partial response to this question. So what you need to do is you need to read carefully, as you need to refer to the title and paragraph 1 of text A. So in addition, candidates are able to scaffold their responses. So when it comes to scaffolding your responses, it's a case of offering an initial response and then building on that response and then building on that second response to which then eventually one would like to think you would come up with a sound and reasonable answer. Okay, so let's get straight into the answer. Text B is portraying the manner in which our morals are compromised by the created images of materialism, in this case, the Hollywood film. The opulent lifestyle of villains is seen as desirable. The headline of text A refers to the effect of a materialistic society. Moral decay erodes our humanity via the imagination. It eats us from the inside out, as the initial title of the comprehension suggests. The possessions idolized by the rich kids of Instagram are similar to the desired lifestyle that's being made mention of in text B. In both texts, materialism is acceptable when it's glamorized. Both the writer and the cartoonist disapprove of our mindless acceptance of materialism. They want us to look beyond that and seek a more, say, grounded way of living and a more kind of authentic way of living as opposed to this materialistic way. Always refer to both texts. So in these types of questions, you need to make the kind of comparison between the two. You can use words like similarly, as in text A versus B, in the same way, for instance. Look for common aspects or messages, and of course alternative ones, because remember the two in some cases differ. Only refer to the parts of the text that are specified in the question. Okay, so don't waste your time now elaborating on other aspects of the text that don't necessarily refer directly to the question. All right, guys, so essentially that is it for today with regards to reading and viewing, specifically focusing on comprehension. I trust that you learned something today with regards to how you can take on comprehension-like questions and what kind of approaches you can take in analyzing those questions in offering sound and meaningful answers. So once again, thank you for your participation today. I trust that it has been enjoyable for you, and we will catch up soon. Wish you all the best. Thank you very much.